Greetings, R. Frederick Riddle here with another Christian News and Views. This is episode 39, so next week will be, well, actually tomorrow will be number 40. It's a major hurdle. Um, Today on Thursdays we normally look at King James Version Bible, and lately we've been looking at this story of Christmas, the birth of Jesus Christ. And so we're going to do that again. Last Thursday we looked at where and when Jesus was born. Today we are looking at the nativity scene that you normally see put up at Christmas time. So the first thing is, let's look at the people who are pictured in that nativity scene. First of all, you have Mary. Now, she is generally thought to be a teenager. Her age has been suggested anywhere from 13 to 19. Have no argument with any of those years. I generally think of her as 16, but it's just because at 16, 14, 15, and 16, they're really starting to turn into a young woman. But that's just a rather arbitrary thought on my part. Just makes it a little easier to picture, but you could choose any age you want. There's no biblical reference that tells us what her age was. At the age of 12, boys were considered adults, so 13 certainly fits in there for girls. So pick your date, pick your year. There's no biblical standard here that we have to be concerned with. Now, Joseph is a little bit different. I have heard some preachers say that he was also a teenager, and that is possible. However, I've been, in my reading of the Bible, I get the feeling, the understanding that back in those days, men waited until they were more financially secure before they started seeking a wife. They had from the time they get engaged to the time they get married was usually about a year anyhow. But they would present a dowry to the father. Well, that would suggest that they had a dowry to give, and that they might have come from their father, their own father, or it may have come from their own work, which is what I tend to think. And so I'm thinking he was possibly in his 30s. He would have had time to build a business, whatever that business was. In the case of Joseph, his dad would have been probably a carpenter. They tended to follow in the footsteps of their fathers. So I think that that's what it was. And carpentry was not a profitable business like you might think. In today's world, you can make some good money as a carpenter. But back in those days, there wasn't a whole lot of money. It was a struggle. But it was their chosen trade. And so I'm thinking that Joseph was in his early 30s, perhaps older, perhaps younger. But I'm picking the early 30s. And of course, in Mary, we already said that I think of her as being around 16. Today, people raise their eyebrows at that, but you go back to this the 19th century of America, and you were seeing wide disparities between the age of the man and the woman. And also, you weren't seeing people getting married because they fell in love with one another. They often got married because parents of the one agreed with the parents of the other that their children would get married. So the idea of getting married out of simply because you're in love with one another is a rather more modern idea. The other person involved here, of course, is the baby Jesus. He was conceived through the Holy Spirit, and so Joseph then was his stepdad, not his real dad. His parentage would be God the Father, and the Holy Spirit. We don't know how it all happened. but the Holy Spirit brought it about to happen. And Jesus, when he was born, was holy and is holy God and holy human. And that is, you have nothing like that anywhere else in any other religion. Um, I don't even like to use the word religion when referring to Christianity. It's a relationship. Excuse me. It's a relationship. And so when you get saved, God the Father becomes your Father. Up until that moment, he's not your Father. Don't believe what the news media tells you. He was not your Father. He was your Creator and is your Creator. All of us were created by God, but we only can choose him or think of him as our Father when we get saved. When you go in and you pray to him and ask Jesus into your heart. Jesus is the Son of God, and so when he comes into your heart, you become a son just like, well, not just like him, but like him. You become a son of God. And the promises are then, that you find in the New Testament, are made to the children of God. And so we are not all children of God when we get first born. We are all the creation of God. But when you get saved, you become a child of God. And that is strictly by the Bible. You have a problem with that, then you have a problem with God. But anyhow, getting back on our story, we have Mary, we have Joseph, and we have Jesus, but they're not the only ones that were there. We have the shepherds. Now the shepherds, back in those days, were amongst the lowest class of people in Israel. They were not highly regarded. Why? Well, they stunk. They worked with smelly sheep, and so they smelled just like the sheep. They didn't have, people back then didn't have baths and stuff like that. They did, but that was usually the wealthier class. They had baths and stuff like that. Most people didn't have that. We got refined noses now, and so we all need to take a bath. So I would not use their bathing practices back then as an example for today. But the thing was, they were considered lowly. People didn't want to be around them, not only because of the smell, but because of their language. I'm not talking about swearing here. I'm talking about they were not educated. They didn't speak with refined tones and words and stuff like that. They were simply the lower class. Then there's a fourth group called the kings, or we know them as the Magi. So that lists all the people who were there in the nativity scene. But the Magi is the subject, or they are the subject for today's podcast. So who were the Magi? Well, it is believed that they were Zoroastrians, priests out of Babylon. It is also possible that they were strongly influenced by the writings of Daniel. They existed, Zoroaster himself existed prior to Daniel. Could have been, I've been writing a book on Daniel, and Zoroaster, if you look up historical, he died before Daniel. But how accurate that is, you don't really know. It's possible he could have faked his death and lived longer and actually had a interaction with Daniel before his death. Don't know that. But in any case, Daniel, who rose up to being a very powerful man in Babylon, he had a big influence, and he eventually took over control of the priests who lived in Babylon at that time. And that would have included any Zoroastrian priests that were there. So his influence, he may have provided some guidance and some influence. Like he would have had at his disposal perhaps some of the scrolls that, for instance, Numbers. And so they had access, I believe, access to, and that's not just original with me, by the way, but they had access to some of the scriptures. They were not by any means Jewish. The Zoroastrians, they believed totally differently than the Jews. What did they believe? They believed in a um, they believed in a it's a bio or bi I can't remember what it is, but it's they believed that there were two forces in the world, a good force and a bad force, and they were basically even equal with one another. That's contrary to the Jews and Christian belief. Jews and Christians believe there's God and He is supreme. There is the devil and He is nowhere near as He wants to be like God, but He is not like God. But he would be represent the evil, the bad. That's as close as they get. After that, they part company. But in one area in which they did agree, some people think of them as astrologers. They were not astrologers. They did study the stars. The Bible says that. They were astronomers. They believed in the science of astronomy. Whether it was called that back then or not is irrelevant. They believed in, and they studied the stars. They did believe that there were signs, but then so did the Jews. The Bible has many signs in it based on the stars and the moon and different things that were there for them to learn from and to apply. But do not confuse them with astrologers. They did not believe in that. They really detested it, and so but they were astronomers, scientists who studied the stars. And in studying those stars, they came across a star. Now, they believed by Daniel's teaching about a coming king. I mentioned Numbers earlier. In Numbers 24:17, which I will read a portion of it here. I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab, and destroy all the children of Sheth. Now, this is not predicting a star in the heavens. The term star there is referencing to a king. But as studying people who studied, or scientists who studied the stars, and they saw this unusual star, not a natural thing. These were not fools. These were not idiots. These were scientists, men who studied the stars. And this particular star was not natural. And so it was never there, and then one day it was there. And stayed there day after day after day. And they may not realize it at first sighting, but as they studied it, they would have looked at it as a new star. Their minds went back to Numbers, talking about a star. And so they interpreted that as meaning a king. That a king that Daniel had predicted would come was now here, or there, actually there. So that is... We don't really know how they thought and how they processed all this, but that seems to be the Bible verse that they go back to. Now, like I said, back in those days, it meant a king, and that is the biblical reference, and that's all they needed. They were not there to be Bible scholars and to be some kind of a Bible discussion. They had that one scripture, it focused in their mind, took on a meaning to them, and as this star just continued to be right there, it didn't go away. They then began to make their plans. They were going to have a caravan, and we're going to get into that in a minute. You see, the Star of David was most likely a divine manifestation, and not a conjunction of stars, as some teach, or some other natural event. In any case, they believed a new king of Israel had been born, and they wanted to go worship him. Well, when did the star appear? Well, I've already mentioned that. It appeared when he was born. How long did it take to travel to Jerusalem from Babylon? Now, remember, we have the Magi appearing in the nativity scene. Well, this would have been rather difficult to do. To travel from Babylon to Jerusalem today, you could probably do it in one day. Get on a train, or an hour or two, get on a plane. But back in those days, they traveled by Jerusalem. Not Jerusalem, by camels. And to travel to Jerusalem would have taken a long time. What did they have to do? They had to establish a caravan. We'll get into the numbers a little bit later, but it would have been a huge caravan for safety's sake. You didn't want to travel all those many miles in just a few people. You would never have made it alive, or if you did make it alive, you would have been robbed of all you had. And so they had to plan it, get it, assemble it, get it ready, get all the camels, get all the anything else that was needed for the caravan, and they may have even have taken some soldiers, hired some soldiers to travel with them for their protection. And so that all took time. And then there was the travel time itself. So when you consider that the time to organize it and to plan the trip and to take the trip, it gets rather long, and it's estimated to be anywhere from 1.5 to 2 years to make that travel or that trip by camel. Now, I personally favor 2 years, as that would allow more time. If you've ever had a planned a trip or anything, you know how things can go awry. But it's just as easy to make it 1.5 years. It's somewhere in between 1.5 years and 2 years for that travel to take place. If everything was perfect and so boom, 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 well, 1.5 years is very possible. I think that there would have been some, maybe even politics, going from, they were not necessarily on a friendly basis with Israel, with the king of Israel for sure, King Herod. And so there had to be some plans that took place. We see a little bit of that when they do arrive in Jerusalem, and the whole town was focused on them and wondering what's all this? What's going on? King Herod saw them, and he wanted to know what's going on. Why is all these people coming? And so he had an audience with them to find out. And let's look at some of this in a minute here. So why are they then in the nativity if they was like 2 years, 1.5 to 2 years later? Well, that's a good question. And my answer, I've never seen anything official on it, but I think that the reason was very simple, and many people, this is not original again with me, but I believe it has to do with, first of all, there was the number of gifts. There are 3 gifts mentioned. But as I told you just a moment ago, make that trip with only 3 people, if they arrived alive, that would have been a miracle. And they would probably have been broke, because they probably would have lost all their material wealth, everything that they had. They probably would have lost it. So it had to be more than 3 of them. So they just came up, and they had to. The other reason is that they had to account when they first came around and started setting up the nativity scene. The people who did it the first time, probably thinking to themselves, well, how are we going to get the kings in there? Well, they just put them in. And most people accepted it. It was not like they were taught there. Back when this nativity, I think it goes back centuries, the people did not even have a Bible in their own hands for a long time. And so they would have accepted that as being part of the nativity without any question. So I already mentioned that there were 3 gifts. So how many Magi do I think there were? Well, like I said, it was traditionally 3. but because of travel, it had to be more. So I think that there were quite a bit more, perhaps. Um, uh, I'd say at least 100, probably. Uh, three gifts, but the different magi would have been bringing different gifts and so forth, but they would have fallen in those three areas. Here's some scriptures that just for your own interest, if you want to follow this out and research it. It's in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Now, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east, referencing Babylon, to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him. You move over to verse 7. Then Herod, when he had privily called the wise men, remember, he's wondering, why are they here? They were not on friendly terms. And how they got into Jerusalem, got to Jerusalem, let alone into Jerusalem, would be interesting to find out about that story, but we're not told. He inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. Now we're finding out how he learned about when Jesus was born. He had a reason. Let's skip over to verse 11. And when they were come into the house, now they traveled from Jerusalem. And by the way, the star, while they were in Jerusalem, they couldn't see the star anymore. That could have been because of the street lights and so forth. I don't know. But when they got back out of the city, the star reappeared, and they followed it, and it took them to Bethlehem. And when they were come into the house, focus on that word, folks, the house, no longer a stable, now a house. They're 2 years in. They saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, which we will study on next week. And so another verse is 16. And this is where we're looking now at Herod's plans. And then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, because when they went to Jerusalem, they went from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. They worshiped the baby Jesus. And that night they had a visitation from angels, and they were warned not to go back the way they came. So they took a different trip back to Babylon. And that's where we pick it up in verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, because they didn't come back, was exceeding wroth, and went forth, and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and all the coasts thereof, from, catch this, from 2 years old and under. So he did the math. They had the scribes there who informed him as to different aspects from the Bible that applied. And so that's how they knew it was Bethlehem in the first place. And now he looked at it and he found, from the information from the Magi, and when they first came to him, he figured it out to be 2 years or less. So he slew all the male babies from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Now, question comes up, why was Joseph still there? Why was Joseph, Mary, and Jesus still in Bethlehem? Well, I think the answer is obvious. They were poor. You didn't travel for free. There was no such thing. Even if you got on, you traveled, this is how they would have traveled. They got themselves, when they first came, they had a donkey that Mary rode, and Joseph probably walked. Well, they would have had to stop along the way. They either had to prepare food in advance, cost money, or they had to stop at maybe some roadside inns or something and pick up some food on the way, or maybe a combination of both. But in both cases, you have a lot of money being involved. Well, they had a trip coming up that they didn't know about. a trip to Egypt. But they had no idea that was coming. But they were poor. So what did Joseph do? He most likely opened a carpentry shop in Bethlehem. And by now, after 2 years, he was settled in a house that he had purchased, and he anticipated he would probably be there for a long time. So the Magi don't belong in the nativity scene, but they are a vital part of the life of Jesus. So leave them in, and if you find or feel the need, explain the who, when, and the why. So that is basically everything we know about the nativity scene. Uh, in the future, in a matter of days, they're going to pack up and head for Egypt. And we're going to be looking next week at the gifts which made it all possible. I hope you've enjoyed this. And if, by the way, if you enjoy this channel, if you like listening to me and to my perspective on things, just subscribe, or you can follow me. You follow me, you'll probably get a notification in your email. You subscribe, the podcast will show up in your channel. By the way, there's 2 podcasts. There's this one, Christian News and Views. The other one is called Becoming a Published Author is Fun, and that's for people who want to write. I give them information, and it's a lot of it comes right out of the course that I teach on authoring, which comes with a publishing package. But that's, if you're interested in that, that'll be available to you as well on the same channel. This whole thing is sponsored by T&R Independent Books, and that was founded in 2014 by my wife Teresa and myself, and that was for our books. But after she passed, God led me to open it up to everybody, especially to Christians. And so I focus on Christians because Christians need to have a voice, and I want to provide that voice to you. So go ahead, subscribe, and by the way, you can check me out at trbookservices.com. I'll see you in the next video.